are here as a great celebration of Tony Janetos, who, I can barely even think of it today, passed away about a year ago this time. And we are going to run through what would have been an in-person Inspire session to talk about his life and his work and his unfinished business. Dave Schimmel is going to lead us off with our first session. He's one of our oldest and dearest friends. He's currently at the Jet Propulsion Lab. He and I and Dennis Ojima all trained as graduate students together under the same major professor. We're ecosystem ecologists. For many years, Dave has been working at the interface of carbon, cycle, remote sensing, ecosystem ecology. And with that, Dave, just tell me when to move along, and I'm going to let you go for about 5 minutes.
I want to begin just a little bit with a few personal notes. I met Tony at a very pivotal workshop in 1988 or 1989, early 1989. I was at NASA Ames at the time, and I was back in Boulder for a workshop that ultimately led to the initiation of NCAR's climate system modeling activity. And Tony and I went for a hike at Break. That was the first time I met him. And since then, he and I interacted in really countless ways. I can't even summarize all of them, and I won't. I don't think Val has forgiven me yet for the London Death March that ruined Tony's prized leather jacket. And today I want to focus on something inspired by the title of the session, The Unfinished Business. Because, next slide, please, Jill. In the mid-90s, Tony, then at NASA headquarters, issued a request for information for ideas for new remote sensing concepts to study the Earth system, and in particular to study ecosystems. And next slide, please. A group of us in Boulder, myself, Greg Asner, I think we went one too far. There we go. Myself, Greg Asner, and scientists and engineers from Ball Aerospace proposed an imaging spectrometer concept that we thought would allow us to look at plant canopy foliar chemistry and indirectly to look at species diversity. And those of you who've followed the biz know that Greg has made quite the industry out of doing this with airborne sensors. The concept was later integrated into airborne sensors for the NEON program. But the idea of doing this from space, although it went through many studies in both the NASA program and the European Space Agency program, and next slide, lingered as just a dream for many years. Tony himself suggested an imaging spectrometer in combination with other sensors in a concept he called recovery from disturbance that would focus on how ecosystems changed both as they became vulnerable to disturbance and as they recovered. But 25 years later, the NASA's decadal survey, the second one, called for exactly an instrument. In fact, it even used some of the words that were in Tony's original concept to quantify the distribution of plant functional traits, types, and composition of terrestrial and shallow aquatic vegetation, observing them spatially and over time. And there were also calls for observing vegetation and habitat structure. Next slide. As it happened, I was in the right place at maybe the wrong time, I'm not sure, to be asked to help lead the science for this mission. And I just want to note in terms of how prescient Tony was in pushing this concept in the early mid-90s. In 2017, the Decadal Survey said that imaging spectroscopy is the only technology that can provide the spectral data to allow identification and quantification of major biochemical and structural components of plant canopies. And so indirectly to observe the functional and ultimately the taxonomic diversity of plant communities. Next slide, please, Jill. A week ago, we advanced a concept to NASA headquarters for a space mission that would have, for the very first time, at its heart, the study of plant communities directly and living communities, including human communities, indirectly, that would focus on diversity rather than on greenness, on function, or on structure. And you know, this is the kind of classic NASA quad chart describing what the mission, which is called SBG, would look like. It would have two platforms, one measuring in the visible and shortwave for plant chemistry, plant function, and plant community composition. A second platform measuring in the thermal that would look at water stress through surface temperature. And it would do this in conjunction with international partners. It would do this about between every day for the thermal and every week for the visible and shortwave. So really characterizing the natural time scales of plant stress and plant composition in a way that really is simply implementing a concept from the mid-90s that maybe we weren't quite ready to do technologically. Back then, we could have sampled the Earth's surface about every 60 to 90 days. Today, we can capture phenology and sample the Earth's surface with similar accuracy and precision, but much greater coverage every 8 to 16 days. So this is important in my mind because if we can go to the last slide, really because it's the first time that the Global Remote Sensing Program has embraced diversity, the diversity of life, rather than the bulk functioning of life as the core of a mission concept. And it's really strikingly similar to a vision articulated now 25 years ago. And there may be one more slide, but I really just kind of want to wrap up there and say that this was unfinished business in my mind for Tony. I don't know how close it was to his heart, but I'm really pleased to report that we're going to close at least one of the unfinished items that he left open when he left us way too soon. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Dave. This is great, and it's great to have you all here. Let me welcome those of you who have joined recently. This is our own little Colorado State University session to honor Tony Janetos. What we are doing is running right through the talks, and I want to introduce our next speaker, which is Emily Therese Cloyd. I'm going to try to queue up her talk, but whoops, I lost it. So Emily is currently the director for the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, Center for Public Engagement with Science and Technology. And when I first met her, she was she led the engagement and outreach program for the US Global Change Research Program. So we all interacted there.
I think, as we all know, there's broad scientific consensus on the realities and risks of climate change. That's something that Tony worked on throughout his career. But he also emphasized, and many of us know, there's a lot more work to be done when it comes to solutions. And a lot of Tony's work was empowering communities to respond. Tony and I first crossed paths, as Jill said, at the US Global Change Research Program, which coordinates climate and global change research across the federal government. And Tony made significant contributions there, both in his federal career and afterward. Along with other authors on the Second National Climate Assessment, he highlighted the importance of collaboration between scientists, policymakers, and the public and private decision makers who are designing effective responses to climate change. The first extended conversation I had with Tony was following 2 workshops that kicked off the 3rd National Climate Assessment process. The flight from Chicago to DC was running late, and he offered me a ride home from the airport because it was pretty late at night. During that ride home, we talked about his commitment to documenting the responses that were already underway and ensuring that the National Climate Assessment would support better decision-making in the future. Tony advocated for an expanded treatment of decision support, adaptation, and mitigation in the assessment as a member of the National Climate Assessment and Development Advisory Committee, and he served as a convening lead author on the mitigation chapter for that assessment. For me, as the public participation and engagement coordinator for the assessment, I benefited from Tony's input as I sought ways to open the assessment process to the public and to ensure that it was relevant for decision makers. Tony also chaired the working group on indicators, and Melissa Kenny is going to take a deeper dive into that work, highlighting the vision to provide useful data and metrics to empower decision makers to address climate change. One aspect of the indicator system that I explored with Tony was the need for a lot of data, some of which can be obtained through citizen science, providing opportunities to link community members, leaders, and researchers in collecting and using that data. Over the years, as I talked with Tony about climate change, many of our conversations returned to such opportunities to establish, build on, and ultimately leverage the links between scientists, community members, and decision makers. A year and a half after leaving USGCRP to join AAAS's Center for Public Engagement, I was getting ready to launch a new climate change related project. My colleagues and I wanted this project to take a different approach to communicating about climate change than many scientific reports. How could we reinforce the important role of science while focusing on how communities were acting? I'm sorry, I think I got a little bit off as I was switching between screens. But as we were formulating how we respond, I reached out to past colleagues, to scientific and community organizations that worked on climate change, and to groups that represented governments and businesses. And Tony gave me a very enthusiastic response about joining this project. He caught me up on the work that he was doing on the Boston University Climate Action Plan and reflected on the importance of recognizing many kinds of communities responding to climate change, including neighborhoods, universities, and governments. Soon he had joined the advisory committee and was helping to frame our approach. How we respond would spotlight communities that were pursuing both adaptation and mitigation and discuss the importance of collaboration between scientists and communities. Of course, this was easier said than done, and Tony provided important contributions as we struggled to balance discussing the enormity of the climate challenge and providing realistic hope in communities that are taking collective action. Tony was on the review team for the synthesis report. He helped us immensely with early drafts of the report and selecting communities to spotlight. But unfortunately, he died about a month before we completed the project. Ultimately, we collected 18 stories from communities across the US, from Massachusetts, Oregon, and Georgia, Kansas and Wyoming, Michigan, Arizona, and Montana, and more. In addition to the written stories, we produced short documentaries about several communities. And I was so glad that we could tell some of these stories because when I first talked to Tony about this project, this was one of the things that he was most excited about, was really showing what was happening on the ground. We also assembled action-oriented resources for individuals and communities that are inspired by the stories and want to identify solutions and bring about positive change, and demonstrating ways to build bridges toward collective action. How we respond is at the core of a new effort to spur more conversations between scientists and communities about working together to address the economic, social, and environmental challenges of climate change. And I hope that we're living up to some of the ideals and ideas that Tony espoused throughout his career. Thank you.
Thank you. What I would like to do now is share my screen and queue up our next speaker, who is Pam Templer. So Pam's a professor at Boston University. She's currently also the Ecological Society of America's Vice President for Education and Human Resources. She's an ecosystem ecologist working on global change issues. This is going to sound familiar as we work our way through. And I've had the privilege of working with her specifically on crossing boundaries between science and policy.
My name is Pamela Templer, and today my talk falls in the session titled A Research Agenda for Tackling Global Change, Successful but Unfinished Business of Tony Janetos. I'll speak about integration of science and policy and how this work continues to be inspired by Tony. I knew Tony as a colleague and friend at Boston University and interacted with him in his role as director of the Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future, and also his role leading BU's Climate Action Plan Task Force, which resulted in BU pledging to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to zero on its campuses by the year 2040. I also worked with Tony on the Governing Council of the Science Policy Exchange, a network of institutions that aim to harness the power of science to generate environmental solutions for people and nature. Tony brought his commitment to solving environmental challenges and his desire to train the next generation of problem solvers. Tony was always a great listener and provided really constructive ideas and was very collaborative. We carry Tony's vision forward to try to meet society's needs by training a diverse community of students who can work through their careers collaboratively across disciplines and institutions to help solve environmental challenges. But how do we train students? For the rest of my talk, I'll provide two complementary approaches and examples that I believe work well to train the next generation of experts who can work together. In the past, a common approach was to provide deep disciplinary training for students so they gain depth of knowledge to become experts in their field. Interdisciplinary training of students more recently became common so students can gain breadth of knowledge, but in many of these programs, students weren't trained to have expertise. More recently, evidence shows we need to train students using a T-shaped approach that combines training in both depth and breadth. We can't expect environmental policy to be based on evidence unless we train scientists on how to work collaboratively with each other across disciplines. Also in the past, the traditional model of training scientists included the expectation that research results would be communicated to the public and then constructive policy decisions would be made. Research shows that this deficit model, whereby the experts don't communicate with policymakers except to share their findings, simply doesn't work. Too often, great results of scholarly work ends up on the shelves of virtual libraries and don't affect policy. A newer approach to science policy integration calls for a dialogue model in which there's talk and there's communication and co-production of knowledge throughout the scientific process, including formulation of research questions, approaches, and data generation. Today, I'm going to provide two examples for how we can train students in effective science policy integration using these approaches. The first program I'll share with you is a graduate training program at Boston University that we call Urban. We know that cities face environmental challenges, and at the same time, graduate students want policy relevant training. So in our program, we use cities as a living laboratory for training in policy integration. This program is supported by the National Science Foundation's Research Traineeship Program, also known as NRT. Our program centers on the fields of biogeoscience, environmental health, and statistics to help students tackle urban environmental challenges related to air, water, and climate. Students are trained through workshops in city governance, science communication, and professional development, and they work in partnership with the private sector, city governments, and non-governmental organizations to develop research questions that are co-produced across academic disciplines and with these partners using a collaborative approach. Our PhD students have worked with a variety of partners listed here in government, non-governmental organizations, and the private sector to help them tackle urban environmental challenges. A second example I'll give is our Youth Environment Alliance in Higher Education, also known as the YA Network, which is also supported by NSF. It provides undergraduates and graduate students from multiple institutions around the world training in international science policy integration. Students conduct collaborative research using collaborative research using the UN Sustainable Development Goals to define their projects. They meet virtually across participating universities, and then they present their findings at the UN COP meetings through events facilitated by the Research and Independent NGO group, also known as RINGO. So in conclusion, I'll say that we need to train students using a T-shaped approach so they gain both breadth and depth. We need to train them in co-production of knowledge through partnerships with the private sector, government, and NGOs. And we thank Tony for inspiring us to keep pushing us for policy-relevant research that can improve the world.
So Ben Lamberty is going to be talking. Ben's a research scientist with the Joint Global Change Research Institute. I have a special fondness in my heart for JGCRI.
Yes.
Because Tony offered me a sabbatical leave office some years ago when Dennis was working at the Heinz Center in Washington, DC. And thanks to Tony, I was able to write a number of papers and interact a little bit with JGCRI scientists. It's a terrific institution, so I'm delighted that they're here. Ben is trained as a forest ecologist, and as similar to what Pam said, he works at the interface between global change issues, carbon and nutrient cycling, climate change in northern ecosystems.
Thanks for the invitation, and thanks everyone. So yeah, I thought in this session, my slides here are titled "The Push to Integrate Earth System and Integrated Assessment Models," and it's about this big project that which I was a part of 10 years ago with Tony, who was my manager, my boss, my colleague at the Joint Institute. Next slide, please. And this was called IESM. 4 simple letters that had a whole lot of stuff beneath it. And the idea was an integrated Earth system model. Next slide, please. And this was something, this was a project to construct something, the sort of the first, what was called an integrated Earth system model. And it brought together, this was, you can see from the agenda 10 years ago, it brought together a whole lot of folks from various national laboratories, from various universities, as well as some, for instance, DOE program managers. And next slide. And the idea here was an ambitious one, and something that really Tony, with some others, but really he was really a big driver here, and really speaks to his, as we're already seeing in these talks, right, his sort of intellectual nimbleness and wide-ranging nature and synthetic approach to things. And historically, when you talked about Earth system modeling, you had sort of research on humans and human systems, in, for instance, what were called integrated assessment models, looking at the effects of changes in policy or energy system that didn't really concern themselves too much with a natural system, at least in very simplified form, but they really in detail looked at the complicated human, again, sort of economic choices, trade-offs, markets, things like that. And then you had Earth system models, which are these incredibly high-resolution, detailed, 15-minute time step-ish models of the Earth system that just use static inputs from the humans. And the problem here, and that's sort of illustrated, that in the illustration there, that vertical dashed line was, before this point in time, a solid wall, really. And the goal here was, you can't really look at either of these systems without considering the dynamism and the feedbacks between one and the other. So to put a specific example there, I guess, humans adjust to changes in climate, right? We are, however fitfully, adjusting policies, emissions, and energy systems to climate change. That is going to invalidate, eventually, these 21st century Earth system model runs using these static inputs. Conversely, the human-centered integrated assessment models are using relatively static approximations of the physical system that are going to become out of date or not going to be valid as well. And so the goal here was to integrate these two. Next slide, please. I as a veteran of this, I cannot tell you the technical challenge here. It was an extremely ambitious thing and a huge lift. The idea that we would start, for instance, with, well, you can start in any place in this loop, but we would have GCAM, this integrated assessment model, running its economic and policy simulations that would then make land use decisions based on the current state of the Earth's climate, along with policy constraints, emissions constraints, targets, things like that. Those land use decisions would go through a downscaling, but then flow into CESM, the Community Earth System Model. They would compute the resulting climate feedbacks, the forcing, and update the climate state for the next 15, in this case, in the initial project, 15-year time step of GCAM. And so each was getting influenced by the other, and running, we first started running in SneakerNet, just sending files back and forth between teams. But this ended up really as a fully functioning joint model. Next slide, please. And that kind of looks like the same slide. So let's just go on to the next slide, please. And what this allowed then was really the first, a fancier, a $10 word to say, way to say it, right, is the first synchronously coupled model of human and Earth systems. And getting a little pixelation here, but what the graphs are showing are on the left hand changes in, although I know it's hard to read, but changes in price. So market prices for commodities like crops and oil crops and rice and wheat, compared to a reference run where the uncoupled models were running, in other words. So you can see you had some significant effects. Prices, because of changes on the Earth system model side of the system, prices were dropping by 15 to 20%. This was from Peter Thornton's paper a few years ago. And on the right-hand side, changes in land area and allocation were also being affected. So again, these two, the human Earth system sides, we demonstrated here sort of significant differences in the coupled system, which has big implications if you want to project out into the future. You can't treat these as isolated. Next slide, I think maybe final slide. No. And this then has led to a whole series of, this was sort of really groundbreaking, forward-looking work. This from Kate Calvin's paper a couple of years ago, sort of putting into model space a lot of the other teams that have subsequently tried this. Or, you know, whether to the degree to which people have tried to have really sophisticated Earth models versus human models versus both. And IESM is this project is unique. It's relatively in the upper right. It tried to really tried to swing for the fences in coupling a sophisticated human model and a sophisticated Earth system model. And it was really interdisciplinarity at its core, which really reflected, I think, you know, Tony's approach, values and approaches to science, policy, education, a lot of areas. And then finally, I think last slide, please. Just on a personal note, I would just say, this was funny to dig up. This is the very first email I ever received from Tony. I was at University of Wisconsin and getting desperate and cold calling, sending cold call letters out. The way I've told this story is I put the wrong letter in the wrong envelope. And apparently I put 2 letters in the envelope to Tony. And I think really reflecting his humanity and humor, he emailed back, or he talked to my advisor. I was like, oh my God, and I sent an email apologizing. And he said, you know, you probably should let Minnesota know they're getting an empty envelope. And, but then also said, you know, we'd like to talk to you potentially about a job. So it's really this really serendipitous thing. You know, on the one hand, the beginning of the talk, the science that I thought that Tony drove, and then just on a personal level, you know, I certainly owed him my first real professional start in science, and it's something I'll always remember. So thanks.
And our next speaker is Mike Dietz. So Mike is also at Boston University. I know him because he's working at the forefront of ecological forecasting.
My name is Mike Dietz. I'd like to talk to you about Tony Janetos' role in the building of ecological forecasting and some of the legacies of that work. For those not familiar, EFI was launched in 2018 with the goal of promoting forecasts as a way to better understand, manage, and conserve ecosystems. EFI functions as an international grassroots research consortium aimed at building and sustaining a community of practice around iterative ecological forecasts, those that are tested and updated as new information becomes available. And thus we tend to focus on the near term, from sub-daily to decadal timescales. The origins of EFI really start with the NEON-funded and PAL Center-hosted workshop that I organized with Andy Fox, who was still at NEON at the time, that aimed to think about the hurdles to advancing iterative near-term ecological forecasting. At that time, near-term forecasting was something that was beginning to occur in agencies like NOAA and NASA, but wasn't really something many academics were thinking about. From the very beginning, this effort really focused on the coupling between iterative forecasting and management, and the potential win-win between accelerating basic science and improving environmental decision-making, which really meshed well with Tony's thinking. While Tony was not at the 2016 meeting, I'd gotten to know him through our department and through his work with Melissa Kinney, who was both at the forecasting meeting and worked on the Indicators project. Even before leaving for the meeting, I'd lined up a post-workshop lunch with Tony to discuss what to do next. This grew into the only real mentoring relationship I've had since starting my own lab, and I really benefited from Tony's perspective, experience, and connections, which is something that I really value and miss. Among the long list of ideas to come out of the 2016 workshop, the first one we tackled was the launch of an award to celebrate and encourage research in this area. I reached out to Beth Gardner, who was then chair of the ESA Statistical Ecology section, later the same day as my initial chat with Tony. With the help of Beth and her successor, Elise Zipkin, we got the award approved and fundraised and is now in its third year. Tony also hosted the launch event for my book in 2017 at the Pardee Center, which he was then director of. One of the most bold suggestions to come out of the 2016 meeting was the idea of establishing a National Center for Ecological Forecasting. Jason McLaughlin put the NSF STC program on my radar in 2016, and we began discussing it in earnest in 2017. Tony was the first person we pulled into our team. From the beginning, we knew that the center was really a long shot, so the three of us assembled our initial group to dive deeply into a visioning and strategic planning exercise on ecological forecasting more broadly than just an STC, knowing that there was a greater than 99% chance that we'd have to fall back on Plan B. What would eventually become EFI's founding committee started meeting approximately monthly in late 2017 and first met face-to-face in January of 2018 at Notre Dame's Environmental Change Initiative. In early August 2018, after many more virtual meetings, Tony hosted a second face-to-face planning meeting, this one at BU's Pardee Center, at which point we pulled the trigger on taking this planning exercise public, and in doing so, officially launched the Ecological Forecasting Initiative. In July 2018, Tony also hosted our first ecological forecasting summer course at the Pardee Center that was led by me and my students and collaborators on our macrosystem project. Not only has this course continued annually, but we worked with NEON to record the original Pardee course and produce two video series, one set of long lectures and a second set of short topical videos that are available on NEON's YouTube channel. More broadly, EFI's educational working group continues to work to help train the next generation of ecological forecasters. Another place Tony played a critical role was in advocating for EFI within BU's administration and helping me to make connections across the campus, from the School of Public Health to computer science to engineering. An example of this was our Research on Tap event, which brought together faculty across campus to talk about ecological forecasting. One of the first things EFI did after its launch was to announce our first conference, which was held at AAAS in DC, which was co-sponsored by Tony's Pardee Center and the Sloan Foundation and attended by over 100 interdisciplinary researchers. While Tony had to cancel his own talk due to illness, I am deeply indebted to the Pardee staff for all the hours they poured into logistics, both pre-meeting and on-site. One of the main ways EFI has continued to build community is through organizing or supporting workshops and conference sessions. EPI's second large conference occurred this spring as part of our new research coordination network, which is launching an open neon forecasting challenge. This forecasting challenge has the goal of trying to predict neon site-level observational data before they're collected. So it's an actual forecasting challenge. It is open to all participants and approaches. And in the first round, which will run in 2021, we're going to try to be forecasting tick and population dynamics, aquatic dissolved oxygen and water temperature, phenocam vegetation phenology, ground beetle biodiversity, and terrestrial carbon and water fluxes and soil moisture. The protocols for these challenges should be released by October, and we encourage you to check the EPI website for more information. The other legacy of our 2019 conference was the launch of EPI's cross-cutting working groups, which are organized around the cross-cutting interdisciplinary challenges shared by members of the forecasting community, regardless of the specific focal systems they work on. Tony was particularly interested in the knowledge transfer and social and decision science groups, both of which are currently co-chaired by Pardee Center postdoc Kira Sullivan-Wiley. Finally, the dream of a National Center for Ecological Forecast is one we continue to strive for. Our SCC pre-proposal was submitted in July 2019 with Tony as the lead on the knowledge transfer team. By the time we found out we were invited for a full proposal, Tony had passed, and Jessica Hellman was invited to take on that role. As of this recording, we're still waiting to hear if we made it to the site visit stage. But even without the center, Tony's left an indelible mark on making EPI a vibrant, growing organization. Thank you, Tony.
So our next speaker coming up is Leanne Sullivan. Leanne's here at Colorado State University. She's a graduate student in the Human Dimensions of Natural Resources Department, which is a boundary spanning department, I will say, incorporating natural resource management as well as social scientist. And before that, she was a communication director for the North Central Climate Science Center, which is a Department of Interior U.S. Geological Survey entity.
Hi everyone, my name is Leanne Sullivan, and I'm going to talk to you today about political activism as an adaptation to climate change, and how community-based activism may actually represent a shift in how we think about pro-environmental behaviors. Tony's work was instrumental in bringing social and ecological dimensions of climate change together. And watching the ways in which Tony illustrated the inseparable link between ecology and society, I became drawn to these intersections. Following my time with Tony as a Pardee Fellow back in 2014, I began to dive deeper into these issues and eventually came to study social and cultural values as a framework through which humanity operates. Particularly, my work came to look at how values, these fundamental beliefs that guide our behavior and our institutions, evolve and adapt in response to our environment. Because what we know is that in the last half century, values in places like the United States and Europe have shifted dramatically, away from perspectives rooted in domination or the idea that earth and water and animals exist to benefit mankind, toward the idea that we should mutually cohabit a shared ecological space. And at the same time as values around nature are shifting, we're also seeing a rise in self-expression values, which catapulted people into politics like never before, as evidenced by activism in Love Canal, the first Earth Day celebrations, and political pressure to enact the Clean Air and Water Acts. But of course, history didn't stop in the 1970s, right? While this decade marked the rise of the environment as a political issue, environmental degradation in the form of global warming, biodiversity loss, and poisoned food and water supplies continued. And today, our carbon emissions have us on track to make parts of this planet uninhabitable in my child's lifetime. But it's not for lack of trying. In fact, this year, we undertook the biggest ever global experiment in individual action to curb climate change. Thanks to COVID, we stopped flying. We reduced travel by car and used less electricity as schools and workplaces were shut down. And as a result, the carbon emissions reductions for 2020 are estimated to be between 4 and 7%, which is great, right? But we also know that a 4 to 7% reduction in CO2 is not scientifically meaningful. According to IPCC scientists, we need to reduce emissions 10 times this much to stay below 2 degrees of warming, 40 to 70% reductions. But what this unintentional grand experiment is shining light on is that the traditional discourses of pro-environmental behavior, like changing our light bulbs, composting our food waste, and recycling the ever-growing mass of plastic in our lives is great. They're also not enough. We are coming to recognize in big and small ways every day that individualizing our response to the climate crisis just can't bring about transformative shifts we need to protect the planet. And so we adapt. In place of light bulbs, we see extinction rebellions, comprised, according to a recent study, largely of citizens who've never mobilized before. We see a new wave of eco-communities focused on democratic decision-making and sustainable living. And instead of campaigns to separate our recycling, we see reluctant activism among white suburban women in Texas and grandmothers in Appalachia, fighting for a livable future in the face of hydraulic fracturing and mountaintop coal removal. From Standing Rock to donut economics, we're seeing the rebirth of a community ethic, the reinvention of that old climate disaster narrative, and a new wave of emancipatory values that are evolving in response to the social and political dimensions of climate change. In Tony's final publication entitled, "Why is Climate Adaptation So Important? What are the Needs for Additional Research?" he states that the past century is an extraordinarily poor guide to inform our expectations of what the future might bring. This can be a frightening statement as we watch sea levels rise and heat waves sweep the Arctic, but it can also be an empowering one. The latter half of the 20th century can be defined by its relative stability and technological advances, but it was also a time marked by political stagnation, isolation, and inequality on environmental topics. Today, our almost daily crises force us to think anew about the interactions between our political systems and our planet, and not just why they exist, but how we exist better within them. Understanding economics, human values, social and political processes as linked to ecology is a relatively new concept, and a lot more research is needed to understand the complex ways in which these systems will co-evolve in response to climate change. As always, I'm thankful for Tony, not only in the foundations he laid and the passion he instilled in me, but for the fact that he has, once again, brought us all together here today to advance that work.
So I'm going to queue up next Dennis Carlberg.
Tony Janetos' legacy will live on in the science of global change, but I'm here to talk about his legacy at Boston University, focused only on the development of our climate action plan. I'm Dennis Carlberg. I've been leading Boston University's sustainability efforts for the past decade. Everyone who knew Tony knew him for his kindness, his principles, and his intellect. I also knew him as a colleague and as a friend. And what I would like to do today is talk about the privilege I had as one of Tony's collaborators on the development of BU's Climate Action Plan, and provide a few snapshots of what led Boston University to be bold. In the beginning, while I was trying to get us organized and define our process, Tony insisted on a grassroots approach where the working groups would self-select because he knew that would work, and it did. Then he said we need to meet with President Brown once a quarter to keep him abreast of developments because he knew that was essential, and it was, especially if we were going to be bold. Once we got started, 3 options for emissions reductions emerged, known as BU Good, BU Better, and BU Bold. Tony said, now we have something. Soon, we only talked about BU Bold because the science tells us we need to be bold. Tony would remind us that our actions alone won't do much, so we brought others along. We engaged the city, the Boston Green Ribbon Commission, neighboring institutions, and others, as we developed a plan to achieve net zero direct emissions by 2040, 10 years ahead of the city, because we need to lead. Every week, I look forward to our meetings with Tony, Cynthia Bearcat, and their team, while we worked with Tony to shape the plan as he probed the questions that needed to be answered. As the Energy Working Group was deliberating the criteria for a renewable energy project, Tony kept coming back to the refrain, not all RECs, renewable energy certificates, are created equal, insisting we make sure the project we choose have the greatest impact on emissions reductions possible. He would remind us that the climate doesn't care where our reductions come from. This drove us to analyze 127 projects in the 4 most carbon-intense electrical grids in the country to find the project that would have the greatest impact on greenhouse gas reductions. Thanks to BU, that project is now under construction. While Tony's loss is a setback in so many ways, he set us up for success. I am pleased to say we have launched the Campus Climate Lab, using the campus's living laboratory for climate change. Tony had a vision to create the Campus Climate Lab and invite students to propose research projects that advance the goals of the Climate Action Plan. We launched the lab earlier this year with great results. We now want to supercharge these student efforts, so we created the Anthony Janetos Climate Action Prize, a financial award to the student or team of students whose research most successfully advances climate action each year at BU and beyond. Pancreatic cancer took Tony from us a year ago this Thursday. Approaching this first anniversary, we have begun fundraising for the Anthony Janetos Climate Action Prize. We hope to raise $100,000 to create an endowed fund to support this prize for the longer term. With generous contributions from Tony's family and some friends, we are nearly a third of the way to achieving that goal. If you would like to contribute, please go to the URL on the screen. In closing, I want to say one of the greatest privileges in my career was to serve with Tony on the Climate Action Plan Task Force. His collaborative nature and science-based focus guided the task force to a position of leadership. We are implementing the plan. We are building the largest carbon-free building in Boston. We have launched the Campus Climate Lab, a wind farm to match 100% of the university's electrical load is nearly complete in South Dakota. We are integrating climate change into the university's curriculum and much more. We really have Tony to thank for this. Thank you, Tony. Thank you for your leadership. And thank you for all you have done for science, BU, and humanity.
I'm going to queue up Melissa. Melissa Kenny is going to be our final speaker in this session. She's an Associate Director of Knowledge Initiatives at the University of Minnesota's ION-E, the Institute on the Environment. She also works across disciplines. I've met her because she's working on ecological forecasting. She works really closely with Tony in many other ways.
As you've heard in the talks today, Tony has had an impact well beyond many scholars. Tony has been my closest intellectual collaborator, friend, and cheerleader over the past decade as we work to build a U.S. climate indicator system. Tony's work over the past several decades synthesizing the impacts of climate change, analyzing mitigation adaptation solutions, and communicating this work to diverse audiences is one of his greatest achievements. Our work on indicators is a culmination. Tony and I wrote on this topic in Frontiers several years ago, calling to systematically track the magnitude and distribution of climate impacts and assess the effectiveness of our actions. Specifically, we envisioned a system of physical, ecological, and societal indicators that communicate and inform decisions about key aspects of climate changes, impacts, vulnerabilities, and preparedness. Such an indicator system would include greenhouse gas and atmospheric composition metrics, national and regional climate variability and change, impacts and vulnerabilities on sectors and resources of concern, and mitigation and adaptation response indicators. Importantly, these multi-sector indicators would provide the long-term tracking that is missing for many sectors and ecosystem impacts. They were designed so users can contextualize the information for their own decisions. When we started envisioning a national climate indicator system, I know Tony's phone call or email was influential in convincing many of you, over 200 in fact, to work on this challenge with us. And together we were able to make influential recommendations and prototypes that created one of the first sustained assessment products of the U.S. National Climate Assessment. The process of development involved 14 technical teams who took a systems approach to recommending both existing indicators and research priorities. The overarching conceptual model includes atmosphere and climate indicators, phenological changes, terrestrial, aquatic, and built environment systems, human health impacts, and greenhouse gas mitigation and adaptation responses. These teams included a range of indicators types, which, when tracked over time, are designed to help us understand trends of national interest. Each team, for example, in this case, the Agricultural Indicators team, built out a conceptual model which helped to identify indicators that are necessary to understand the critical aspects of their system. This was used to recommend specific indicators. Given these initial recommendations, we produced a robust process of indicator production and over 40 prototypes given existing data sources as a proof of concept. A subset of these prototype indicators were produced by the U.S. Global Change Research Program as one of the first sustained assessment products of the U.S. National Climate Assessment in 2015. Key to the model we proposed is using a research approach to provide an evidence-based instead of feedback-based approach to indicator visualizations and improvements. And though the full vision of the indicator system proposed has not been implemented, the indicators have continued as a sustained assessment product and were part of the 4th National Climate Assessment. Tony's legacy in this area will be codified as a special issue in climatic change. For all of us who worked on this, it is our and Tony's long-term vision, which is represented in part in the overview paper in the special issue, which he wrote. Tony's legacy is well beyond this indicator's work. Tony always uplifted others and created the institutional structures in his workplace that required high standards but empowered people to work together to achieve things they could not do individually. He was candid but kind in his critiques. He demonstrated that our success can be defined by how we give to others and modeled a we versus me approach to his work. And he was a fierce champion and ally for female and underrepresented scientists, often using his soft power to correct exclusionary behavior. Over this next week and year, in honor of Tony, I ask you to uplift others, give without exception or expectation of credit or reciprocity, and to support a professional environment that values diverse voices.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you to all of you. The breadth and the depth of Tony's accomplishment and visions are truly overwhelming, as we have all seen, and this is a remarkable credit to his achievements, these sessions that we just had. We were all shocked when we heard of Tony's passing, and a number of us got together. I want to give credit to Rosina Bierbaum, to Peter Backlund, to Dennis Ojima, who said, well, let's do something at next year's ESA. And we created this little session only to realize that holding it in person is still something ahead of us because of COVID happening right now. But all of you have helped to contribute to honoring his memory. And for that, I'm truly grateful.